Welcome to Camtasia Studio 7. If you're new to Camtasia Studio and you want to get started quickly, you're in the right place. We encourage you to watch this 5-minute video to learn the basics of using the editor, including how to navigate the timeline, make some basic edits, and add special effects. The preview window is where you see the video during playback. The playback controls are located under the preview window. In fact, the video you're watching in the preview window is a sample project playing directly from the timeline you see below. After you watch this video, we hope you take some time to practice what you've learned using the content on the timeline. So let's start with the timeline. This is where you assemble and edit your videos. At the top of the timeline, tick marks represent time in terms of minutes and seconds. When building a video, you'll work in a horizontal manner, beginning from the left and moving sequentially through time towards the right. To make precise cuts and selection, use the zoom slider to magnify the view of the timeline. And when adding elements to your video, such as a call-out or audio clips, these are placed on different tracks. Tracks are created automatically, when you need them, when elements are added to the timeline. So depending on your video, you may be working with several tracks at one time. To change the position of an element on the timeline, just drag it. To change the length of an element, drag the edges in either direction. An important part of the timeline is the playhead. The playhead moves the timeline and indicates the current frame displayed in the preview window. To view your video, click play in the preview window. Notice how the video and the timeline's playhead stay in sync? Click anywhere on the timeline and the playhead moves to that point. The green section of the playhead is called the in point. Click and drag the in point to make the beginning of a selection. The red section of the playhead is called the out point. Just click and drag the out point to make the end of a selection. To bring the sections of the playhead back together, double-click the gray playhead. To split a video clip, position the playhead at the desired location and click the split button. And if you want to remove a portion of your video, make a selection with the in and out points, then click the cut button. If you make a mistake while editing, click the undo button. Next, we'll look at the clip bin and the library. The clip bin holds recordings, audio files, images, and title slides being used in the project you're currently working on. Then there's the library. It stores video clips, intros, callouts, title slides, and other elements that you want to use from project to project. The library is also pre-populated with professional animations, music, sound effects, and other content you can use in your video for free. To add your own clips or video sequences to the library, make a selection on the timeline, right-click, and choose Add to Library. To include clips and other elements in your video, drag them from the clip bin or library and drop them onto the timeline. The tabs located above the timeline are task pages used for adding and editing special effects. You can add callouts to emphasize a key point. You can insert a transition between clips for a professional look. Apply zoom and pan effects to focus on important details. And draw attention to the cursor by changing the color, size, and more. If you double-click an element on a track, the playhead moves to the beginning of that element, and its task page opens, allowing you to make edits to that element. So we've shown you a few ways you can navigate and edit your video, but how do you get content into your video? Well, to make a new screen recording, click the Record Screen button. If you already have an audio or video recording to use, click the Import Media button. When you've made edits and added effects to your video, and you're ready to share it, you need to produce the project to create a shareable video. Click the Produce and Share button, step through the wizard, and Camtasia Studio creates a viewer-friendly, shareable MP4 file ready to upload to screencast.com, your blog, or a website. Well, it's time for you to try Camtasia Studio out for yourself using the content on the timeline.
fine. I'm going to try to make
The help
this
file in
as simple as
Camtasia
I can.
Studio will help you use each of the
So,
Camtasia Studio
in
features
this,
and applications.
slide right here, you can sort of see that
The Learning Center on TechSmith.com has in-depth video tutorials and other sample projects to download and practice with. So we hope you enjoy Camtasia Studio. And happy screencasting!
So your optic nerve carries that component. So if I see that full glass of water and I think I want to drink it, so I'm going to pick it up. So your optic nerve senses that, and basically the neurons will carry that impulse, that sensory input of seeing and wanting that, and carries that to the brain, at which component of integration will start to occur, and that integration basically involves the spinal cord. And from the spinal cord, what ends up happening is that this kind of sends the message to the brain. The brain then kind of interprets it, and then will send a motor neuron response back that then goes out the efferent component of the spinal canal, and then sort of gives action on the effector muscle, which is going to cause you to pick something up. So that's again a very simplistic way of looking at how this kind of all works. So going on a little bit further, let's just sort of take a look at a motor neuron. So when we're talking about a motor neuron, just keep in mind that, just like any other cell, you have a nucleolus, and I always think the motor neurons look like an alien because you've got all these dendrites, and again, these dendrites will attach to receptive areas, muscles, whatever. And then from the nucleolus, you've got the axon, and the axon is kind of interesting because it is wrapped with what we call this myelin sheath, and it's composed of lipids. And the thing about the myelin sheath is that I just kind of think of it as taking a paper towel holder and just wrapping each one of those paper towels around and around and around and around, so that when you have a complete neuron, you've got this completely wrapped component that has lipids on it, and which allows impulses to be carried fairly quickly from one neuron to the other. So again, just the basic feature of a neuron. Also keep in mind that we're talking about any sort of action potential. It's kind of an all or none, so that if you start an action potential, it's going to finish. If you don't start it, it's not going to finish. If you take a look at a synapse, and if you take a look at the synapse, and we kind of take a look at a neuron, and you look at it from a very cellular level, you can sort of see that that at each terminal of a neuron, you're going to at the axonal terminal, you are going to have various vesicles, and you're going to have chemical reactions that occur. Remember that at the axonal terminal, you are going to have a release of various substances, and for the most part, when we're talking about what is being released, well, we kind of think about the fact that oftentimes what is released is going to be mediated by acetylcholine. Now, on the postsynaptic neuron, you're going to have receptors, and again, these are going to the neurotransmitters are going to be picked up by these receptors on the postsynaptic membranes. And some of the more common things that you're gonna hear about, at least from a nervous system component, is going to be some of the chemical reactions include things like dopamine and acetylcholine, and these are the ones that become, I think, more and more critical because they play a bigger and bigger role of how the neurons kind of function and how your body will pretty much function. So as we go further and further on, let's drop back to the spinal cord. So this is, again, just taking a look at a typical spinal cord. You can see that in the cross section you've got an area of gray matter, and you know, some people say that it kind of looks like an H, and it does, but remember that depending upon where it is, you might actually see more gray matter than white matter. So by the time you get more distally, you're going to see a lot more gray matter than you will white matter. Keep in mind that the gray matter contains a lot of neuronal cell bodies and synapses, where the white matter is going to be ascending and descending fiber pathways. So the ascending pathways basically are relaying sensory information that's going back up to the brain, and the descending pathways are kind of relaying motor instructions that are coming down from the brain. So as you can sort of see in this cross section, you actually have an afferent fiber, so you're getting some sort of a sense that might be from your finger that's going to go all the way into the spinal cord at the level where you have receptors that go to the spinal cord, and they're going to come into the spinal cord itself, and it can do several things. So you can sort of see that it might connect with another intraneuron, and then it may actually connect to an efferent neuron, in which you can kind of get a simple reflex where you get a sensory component that comes in, and it meets up with an intraneuron, which then sort of meets up with an efferent fiber, and then this is carried back to the extremity to cause your muscles to do something, like move your finger or move your hand or stomp your toe or whatever. So that's one component that is happening. The other component is that again, if you touch something and this response comes in to the spinal cord, it can come in, and then it can also do another thing, and that is it might go into the white matter and ascend. Would you just shut up? Shut up! No! No! So it can go ahead and ascend to the brain, and where your body can sense something and then send another motor response down. So there's a couple things that can actually happen in the spinal cord itself. Again, when we are looking at sort of a typical stimulus, one thing to keep in mind is that nerve cell bodies might be one of three things. So they can be sort of sensory neurons, which are receiving impulses from the periphery. It could be the connector or interneurons, and these can be transmitting impulses to the skeletal muscles, the connector neurons, which are the linking. So they're linking the sensory and the motor neurons, And this can be at the same or different levels. And this, when you have an interneuron, this is kind of doing that spinal arc. So it kind of comes in and it goes out very quickly. And then the last kind of neuron that you're going to have is going to be your lower motor neuron. So your lower motor neuron is transmitting impulses from the gray matter, typically, and it is going to an effector area, which is typically your skeletal muscle. So again, stimulus, receptor to a interneuron association, which then can go to an effector, which is going to go back to the muscles to do something. Now, the other thing that can also happen is that you can have sensory nerves from different organs and tissues that come in, and again, as I said, they're going to pass upward, so they're going to pass in the white matter, and these are going to go straight up to the brain. And so, you know, we do have these ascending neurons that, again, are going to go up to the brain, and they are going to cause typically something to happen. So we typically have two kind of two main sources of sensation that's transmitted to the brain from the spinal cord. So we've got typically the skin. So we got sensory receptors or nerve endings in the skin, which are called cutaneous receptors. And these are typically stimulated by things like pain, heat, cold, pressure. And then you also have receptors that are on the tendons, the muscles, and joints. And these sensory receptors are kind of specialized nerve endings, and they're called proprioceptors. And a little bit different, so different from the skin is that they're not stimulated from heat or cold, touch, pain, but they're more stimulated by things such as stress. So our body is kind of modulated by these various receptors, both in the skin as well as the ones that are on the muscles and tendons. So if you take what's happening from the receptors on the muscles and tendons, you have these they're called the alpha motor neurons, and some people will also call them the lower motor neurons, because these are the ones that innervate the skeletal muscle, and these cause the muscle contractions that will cause us to move. So we know that the motor neurons release acetylcholine at the synapse, and then when the acetylcholine binds to the receptors on the muscle fibers, then an action potential is propagated along that muscle fat fiber. And that action potential is the thing that's going to trigger the contraction of the muscle itself. So one thing to keep in mind is that when we look at our movements, you know, it really does rely a lot on our lower motor neurons, these ones that are innervating the skeletal muscle and causing contractions. And let's take a look a little bit further into what's, if again we take a look at our cross sections. Keep in mind that this is a fairly sophisticated kind of process that's going on, and I just want to show you the slide so you can understand sort of what actually is happening. That you from this cross section you can sort of see that the neurons are oftentimes clustered in this columnar component, which they call a motor neuron pool. And all the motor neurons in this pool will innervate a single muscle. And all the motor neurons that innervate a particular muscle are contained in the same motor neuron. Therefore, there's always this one-to-one relationship between a muscle and a motor neuron pool. But if we take each individual fiber in a muscle each fiber, so each one of these little strands of fiber is innervated by one and only one motor neuron. So the combination of these individual motor neurons and all the muscle fibers that it innervates is what we call a motor unit. So you need a lot of neurons to actually be able to make a response to occur. And so when we're looking at the neurological system, we have to keep in mind that there's a whole lot of things that can happen, and there's a lot of things that we will end up testing for as we see patients with various components. So as we go in further, again, I want to sort of address mainly the gray matter and the white matter. And what you're gonna see again that what's happening at the spinal cord level is that you have an afferent sensory fiber that's coming in, and it's coming into the dorsal root ganglion, and then it will go into the spinal cord itself, and then there's also going to be a potential ventral component, again from the gray matter, that goes out in an efferent manner that's going to go back to the skeletal muscle. And this is a simple reflex, so sensory in, motor back out. And that's the gray matter. So this is just completely a very simple reflex arc. Now, in the white matter, so remember the white matter is highly myelinated. This is the area that's a lot of sensory function is being made. But in the white matter, you're going to hear a couple different terminologies that's going to occur, and there are even subdivisions of the white matter that we're going to see in a second. But keep in mind that in this white matter, you are going to have a lot of axons, and within these axons are going to be different kind of tracks that are going to carry certain sensation and or motor components to the brain and from the brain. So the big three that I think that's important to keep in mind are from the ascending track. So if we take, again, this is a cross section of the spinal cord. Here's my gray matter, and this dark blue area is considered to be the white matter. There are different areas of the white matter that are extremely important, but the ones that are the most important are going to be these three. And the first one is so I'm going to break this up into ascending tracks. So these are coming into the spinal cord, and these tracks are going to continue going up toward the brain. So as we go higher and higher and higher, it is carrying impulses higher and higher up. So the first one is the dorsal columns, and these are kind of divided into the vesicularis gracilis and vesiculus cutaneus. So this area, the dorsal columns, if you ever see dorsal columns, associate this as being posterior columns. These areas right here are important with being able to assess your body position, your crude touch, pressure, and vibration. Okay, so this becomes a very important component in the ascension of these major components. In addition, you also have this area here called the lateral spinal thalamic area, and this is where pain and temperature is carried, again, in the white matter. So these are the main ascending tracks that are in the spinal cord. On the descending, so these are descending, coming down from the brain, you have this area in here called the lateral cortical spinal tract. And this area is extremely important in the voluntary control of skeletal muscles. Now, you can sort of see there's also these other tracts, the rubrospinal and the ventral cortical spinal and the vestibular spinal. Now, these, I'm not saying that these aren't important. These are, again, very important in helping to balance, but they don't, they're not as important in terms of your overall ability to control your muscles as much as the lateral corticospinal, because these are the ones that are really going out to your extremities, versus the rest of these are more sort of the central muscles, affecting the central components for your balance. So let's take this a little bit further, and we're going to go down to one of the sensory tracts. So again, as we take a look in our spinal cord, we have there's afferent fibers that are registering pain, temperature, position, and touch. And so these afferents basically are coming from the afferent nerves, and then they come in to the spinal cord along the posterior root. And then what ends up happening is that these afferent fibers, which again, pain, temperature, position, and touch, are going to do one of two things, and it just depends upon which tract they go. So the spinothalamic tract, which carries pain and temperature and crude touch, so we're going to focus on the blue lines. So let's just sort of say that I'm going to touch a hot stove. So I'm going, that sense of this is hot is going to be carried along my spinothalamic tract. And what's going to happen is that those impulses and that sensation is going to go through the spinal cord, and it's going to immediately cross right at that area where it's being carried into the spinal cord, and it's going to go along the spinothalamic tract in the white matter, and then it's going to ascend all the way up to the brain. And then it's going to go to the thalamus, and then from here to the cortex. The other kind of sensation is going to be vibration, position, and light touch. And so let's just sort of say that, you know, I'm outside and I can tell that my finger is pointing to the sky to identify some sort of star in the sky. So that sensation that I can point upward to the sky with my finger is being carried, again, into my spinal canal, and it's going to go into the posterior column, so those areas that are located along this area right here, which is also called the dorsal columns. And so that sensation is different from the spinothalamic in that it enters into the spinal cord and then immediately goes straight up to the medulla and then crosses over and goes into the thalamus. So when we're talking about if I'm touching something that's hot, that sensation is going to be immediately crossed over in the spinal cord according to which level those nerves are coming out from my spinal cord and or carried in, and then it ascends to the brain, versus if I'm talking about position and fine touch, that is going to immediately ascend at the level that it is distributed to the periphery, and it goes straight up into the brain. So again, keeping in mind that pain, temperature, crude touch crosses immediately at the spinal cord up through the thalamus, and this is just again a larger component of that. So again, it comes in through the posterior root, spinothalamic is going to cross and then ascend versus my dorsal or posterior columns is going to ascend immediately. So what does this all mean? Well, you know, the key to this is the fact that what's going to happen, let's just say that somebody has a lesion of the spinothalamic tract. So that would be the pain and temperature. Let's just sort of say that, you know, whether or not somebody had an injury or a stroke or something happened that you injured your spinothalamic tract. If you have a lesion, like let's say here at T5, or even higher, if it's what's going to happen is that you're going to lose pain, temperature, and light touch on the opposite side below the level of the lesion. So let's just sort of say that I have something in you know, T5 in the spinothalamic tract. So that basically means that on my left side, I'm kind of trying to be anatomically correct here, on my left side, I am not going to be able to sense any sort of pain, temperature, or light touch below that T5 on this left side. So it's again, it's going to affect the opposite side below where the lesion or where the problem is actually coming from. So what happens when we go even higher? And then we get to sort of the thalamic area. And the thing about the thalamic area is that this is an area that I call the relay station. And so we know that the spinothalamic tract and the posterior or dorsal columns are bringing these so they're bringing these sensations. They're carrying these messages up to the brain. And so what happens is it stops at the thalamus, and then the thalamus kind of starts to process all this, and then it kind of relays. So then it kind of directs where specifically in the brain, where in the cerebral cortex, that there is a relationship of perhaps touching something and knowing that this is going to correspond in my cerebral cortex to a specific area on my brain. And it's actually the thalamus which helps to sort of regulate that. So and I think that this is kind of showing that. So again, here we have our spinothalamic, and we also have our posterior columns, and they kind of stop next after coming from sort of the periphery at the thalamus. And the thalamus, again, then redirects it to where it needs to go to a corresponding area on the cerebral cortex that corresponds to, again, your finger, your toe, your nose, wherever it needs to correspond. So I'll let you think about this. So let's just go through this. The sensory tract is made up of what specific tract that controls what three things? And then we're talking, the other thing is that the sensory tract is made up of which columns which control which three things. So again, I want you to make sure you sort of understand this concept so that you can sort of see that as things go on, it gets even a little bit more complicated as we run into people who might have issues. So we were just talking about the sensory pathway. So we're talking about position sense, we're talking about pain, temperature, crude, light touch, things like that. We also have the motor pathways. So now that you've got this sensation that's in your that's being relayed to your brain, it also has to send a message down for your body to respond in certain ways. And there's three major pathways that we have to think about, and that is the cortical spinal, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellar. So cortical spinal tract is probably the most important, because this is the thing that helps us with our voluntary movement and integrates all of much of our skilled, delicate movements, our ability to write, our ability to do a lot of walking. And then we also have the basal ganglia, and the basal ganglia includes three components: the caudate nucleus, the putamen, or actually four components: the nucleus, ventral striatum, and then the globus pallidus. Now, the basal ganglia is kind of the area that gets affected with people who have Parkinson's disease. So we're talking about these areas right here, and the thing about these areas here is, and the thing about the basal ganglia is the fact that the basal ganglia is also important for muscle tone. And in the basal ganglia, there's actually two distinct pathways that we'll talk a little bit about later. And one's called the direct pathway, and the other is called the indirect pathway. And so, what happens as signals are brought back down, it can follow these one of two paths: the direct pathway, which actually makes excitatory connections into cortical neurons. And so okay, so you have these the indirect pathway and the direct pathway, and these pathways actually have opposite effects on the thalamic target structures. So what happens is that the direct pathway can excite the thalamic neurons, which then make excitatory connections with the cortical neurons, which again makes us kind of move purposefully. Then, and this is kind of counteracted because you also have an inhibitory effect on thalamic neurons coming from the basal ganglia. So really our balance and some of our gross motor activities is really a balance between these direct and indirect pathways that are stemming from the basal ganglia. So that that when people have issues in their basal ganglia, you can actually get some of these very odd kind of movements that are only seen when people have basal ganglia issues, because what happens is that one of the components, the direct pathway or the indirect pathway, is off keel, and so that you might have too much excitatory components that are being stimulated, and that off balance will give you some abnormal movements, which can be associated with things like Parkinson's disease. And then the final thing is cerebellar, and again, that is another thing that is important with motor activity as well. So going on, we're going to go to the next slide, and I want you guys to take a look at this neural anatomy tutorial, because it's actually quite good, and this guy is a really good instructor, and he's got a good visual that you can certainly follow, just showing how the motor or the cortical spinal tract is actually coming down from the brain and crossing over in the medulla. So it's time for some fun. this is the dragster in Cedar Point, and if you ever want a wild ride, this is like way too much of a rush. And 425 feet is a big drop, even for me. So, you know, we've been talking a lot about sort of the neurological exam at the cellular component, but also keep in mind that when we're talking about the mental, about the just the neurological exam in general, you also have to think about what's happening in people's mental status. And back in the 70s, somebody came up with this sort of examination, which they call the mini mental state exam. And what this is actually doing is it's kind of testing different components of the brain in a different way. So, you know, we talk about testing the neurological exam about pain and temperature, and we're going to learn about those. But there's also the thought process that goes along with it, because the mental status is kind of trying to assess the different lobes of your brain. So the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, the thinking components that are also important. And although much of this kind of relates more to behavioral medicine, and you're going to get a lot more of these various abnormalities in thinking processes, it's still part of the neurological exam. And so the mental status exam is a way in which we kind of assess a person's thought process and see whether or not they are able to comprehend and they're able to have their cognitive components are all intact. Oftentimes we use the mental status exam as a way to assess for dementia, but in some ways we can also use it to follow people who have had brain injuries and things like that. So when we're looking at the mental status exam, there's different components that we are always going to be looking at. And a lot of times when you see a patient, you yourself are kind of making up in your mind what somebody's mental status, even if you're not cognitively thinking about it. But really, when we're looking at somebody's mental state, we're breaking it down into 6 major categories. The first being their appearance and behavior, the second their speech and language, third is being their mood, fourth their thoughts and their perception, and then 5 and 6 are their cognitive functions. So let's kind of break these down a little bit farther, and let's just take a look about their appearance and things like that. So when somebody comes in, one of the things you're going to be assessed is what is their posture? How are they sitting? How are they looking at you? Are they not looking at you? Or are they looking off at the sky? Are they looking off to somebody else? What's their grooming? Are they appropriately groomed? Are they appropriately dressed for the day? Do they know how to button their buttons correctly? Do they seem like they've washed or not washed? Are they taking care of their hair? All those kind of things we are kind of assessing. We're looking at their facial expressions. Are they able to exert some sort of facial expression, or do they just seem very flat or masked, meaning that they don't seem to be able to show you any expressions, because that can give you some idea might be going on. And then how are they relating? So how are they what is their mannerisms? Are they anxious, or are they kind of elated, or are they depressed? Are they able to relate to the people in the room? And then the next thing that we kind of take a look at is their speech patterns. So one of the things that you're going to notice is their quantity of speech. So do they seem like they can talk in complete sentences, or maybe they just want to answer in 1-word or 2-word sentences? And then we're also going to sort of see the modulations, meaning that is it all like is the rate the same? Is it monotone? Is there inflections? Is it too loud or is it too soft? And can they say the appropriate words, what we call the articulation of words? Or, as you see with some people, when they have some mental illnesses, they can start to make up words, which we call neologisms, which are non-existent words, or they won't use words appropriately. And then, we're looking to see their fluency, meaning, can they speak in complete sentences, or do they have difficulty in even completing a sentence? And sometimes what we do when we're examining patients is that we ask them to do certain, we have conversations with them. We ask them to identify various things like a paper, a pen, or whether or not they can read, whether or not they can write. So again, we're identifying a person's speech and language. The next thing that we go into would be their mood. And is their mood normal? Is it abnormal? Do they seem to be sad or elated? Do they seem suicidal or homicidal? Like, do they want to kill themselves, kill others? Do they seem abnormally anxious or worried? Or do they have indifference, like they just don't care? Or, these are some of the things that we're trying to assess. And then we get to sort of kind of the fun process. I always think that these are fun, and that's when people have mental illnesses. What becomes, I think, one of the more important concepts is what are people's thoughts and perceptions. And so, are they thinking logically? And some of the things that you're going to learn how to identify is some of the characteristics that people may have when they have various mental illnesses. And so some of these variations include this list, and I'm going to sort of go through these a little bit. When people have mental illnesses, and the things that you're going to run in a lot are going to be people who have depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, paranoia, and then there's always a lot of subsets of these. When people tend to have mental illnesses, they tend to start to think a little bit odd. And we think it's odd, they don't think it's odd, but it is an illness. And some of the things that we use to identify this is kind of their thoughts. So one of the things you might actually find is people who might start to have what we call circumstantiality. And circumstantiality is where and I'm sure you have come across a person in your life, probably in your family or a good friend, who has circumstantiality. And that's the kind of person who uses excessive detail and indirection and delay in reaching the point. So I call this the long-winded person. So, you've got that person who you say, hey, what did you do yesterday? Well, I got out of bed, but I didn't really want to get out of bed because it was 6:56, and I typically want to stay in bed till 8:01, but I wanted to make sure that I got that 4 minutes of sleep. So I wanted to make sure that I set the alarm to go off at 8 o'clock, but I didn't want the alarm to go off with music. I wanted it to be with sound. And so it takes forever for somebody who has circumstantiality to get to the point. It's so much detail that it's very hard to get something that typically would take maybe 2 minutes, might take 2 hours to come out. The next thing is loosening of association. And this is somebody, this is really a thought disorder in which there's a series of ideas that are presented with perhaps a logical, inapparently logical connection, and they might be very loose. So an example of this would be, you might be talking to somebody and he might say, he went to the ballpark and bought Frank's beer and brought Frank's beer belly home in a bag of grass seed. So there's a lot of associations there that are not really associated very, very closely. The other thing that people might have is flight of ideas. And a flight of ideas is different from loosening of associations, because what happens is that you have this very accelerated speech that's going along with a person changing from topic to topic. Or it can be very loosely connected, but it's so fast and rambling that you really don't have any idea what they're actually talking about. Neologisms are invented or distorted words. So this is very common, especially when you got somebody who's schizophrenic. They might, all of a sudden, they'll kind of talk about this word, will come out of their mouth, and you're like, what was that word that they just said? An example of this would be like, I have a heptaplanic under my bed. And they will talk like heptaplanic means something to them, but you're just saying, I just don't know what that means. Incoherence is when somebody has incomprehensible, you have no idea what they are talking about, because they're talking in nonsense. It's illogical. There's no connections that make sense. They're using words or grammar that is completely out of order, and it's kind of like, I call it babbling, and that would be somebody who might be incoherent. Blocking, okay, I can tell you I block sometimes. I used to be a really bad blocker, and that is what's happening is a person might be going down a line of thought, and then all of a sudden they get a thought that comes into them, and they're unable to finish their original thought because that original thought is being blocked by something new coming in. So you might be talking to somebody, and they might be talking in a sentence, and all of a sudden they stop. And then they may be able to finish it, but you have a pause that actually occurs, and that is blocking. Confabulation is when things are just made up. And I mean they are just some of the craziest things that people will say. You will be like, oh my gosh. And it's just they just come up with things that mean no sense at all. Perseveration is there's a really good example of this in one of the videos from Bellevue, in which a person will repeatedly use words or sentences over and over again, or they might draw something over and over again. Echolalia is repetition of words or phrases back to you. Like you're interviewing Johnny, you say, Johnny, what are you doing? And Johnny says, Johnny, what are you doing? So they kind of repeat what is said to them back to you. It's kind of an odd kind of characteristic that you will come across. Clanging is another odd one, and this is a type of speaking in words where words are chosen for their related sounds rather than their meanings. So an example of this would be like somebody tries to rhyme words, like he went in the entry in trying to time, sign, dime, ding dong, dangles, dashing, dancing, dingling. So people will kind of add all these clanging type of words on to the sentence that really means nothing. And then finally we have tangential, and this is when the patient rapidly diverges to other unrelated topics. So you'll kind of start off going down a road, and then all of a sudden they'll start going off into something that's not really related. So an example of this is when sometimes you'll see this a lot with people who have had strokes in the frontal area or trauma in the frontal area. And one example is you had a guy who, they were interviewing, and they asked him what he got for Christmas, and he said, I got a record player and a sweater. And then he looks down in his boots and he says, I also like boots, Western, popcorn, peanuts, and pretzels. And another example is when they talk to a patient and they ask, in what manner are an orange, a banana alike? And he said, fruit cakes, haha, tutti frutti. And then asking the same person how a lion and a dog are alike, he says, they both like fruit. Haha, no, that's not right. They like trees, fruit trees. Lions climb trees and dogs chase cats up trees, and then they both have a bark. So you start down this pathway, but then they kind of go on these tangential kind of routes that are really hard to sort of understand. So that's what some of those components are. And then we get to, I kind of think, even the more interesting one, and that's perception and insight and judgment. Perception is basically how do you perceive the world. And what this means from a psychological manner, and when we're talking about perceptions, is for the most part, we're talking about people who have hallucinations. So oftentimes when you see people who have schizophrenia, especially paranoia, they will basically have various types of hallucinations. So hallucinations are false beliefs that they're false things that are occurring. So they might say, oh, somebody's out to get me, the government's out to get me, they're watching me, they're observing me. And so they hear things. They might hear things or see things that are false, yet the patient thinks this is absolutely happening. It's true, it's true, it's true. And so, one of the things that I find to be one of the more interesting is how do you approach somebody who's thinking like this? What are the kind of questions that you might want to ask? So some of the things that you can ask would be, do you ever hear things that other people don't hear, or do you see things that other people don't see? Another question would be, do you feel that somebody is watching you or trying to hurt you? Or sometimes even, do you have any special abilities or powers? Because even though we might think these questions might be absolutely crazy, the people who have these mental issues really do believe this is happening to them, that they are God, they hear God, they see people trying to hurt them. And so you have to talk to them as if this really is happening in their lives. The other thing that we assess is going to be insight and judgment. And insight is how do people, are people able to identify themselves and their flaws and their issues? So can they identify in them that they might have a problem? And, insight, I think, covers a lot more further than mental illness. I mean, you have people in your daily lives who have no insight into themselves. And as mental illness sort of adds on to somebody, you can see that with some of the mental illnesses that they really have no idea that of what is happening within themselves. Judgment is a person's ability to make relatively sound, reasonable, and responsible decisions. And so the way that we approach this from a mental status exam is we kind of ask people standard hypothetical questions, such as, if you were in a theater and you smelled smoke, what would you do? So you would assume that people who have at least reasonable judgment would say, I would call 911, I would leave, I would do something like that. Or, you want to see what people's response are to this. Take a look at this video. It is Gerald. This is probably my most favorite video that I actually incorporate because it's so doggone interesting. He is a schizophrenic, and they kind of follow him in the interviews, and you can sort of see that in this video that you watch, you'll see a lot of the things we had just talked about, and you can sort of see where his thought processes really are. So again, here's an example of a mini mental status exam. This is from the University of Michigan, and basically, again, if you have somebody that you might think that you're wondering, geez, is this person able to, is this person sort of becoming dementia or becoming demented, or perhaps you're worried about whether or not they're able to function with their daily, their items, their daily living, their activities. And so some of the things that we do is we do a mental status exam in which you basically ask a series of questions and you get a response, and then from that response you grade it and you score it. And over a period of time, we've been able to find out that normally if somebody is within a normal range, they should have a mini mental status score of at least 24. And that might go a little bit lower depending upon a person's baseline, meaning like what their educational background is. But in general, we want to see a normal range of about 24 to 30. And so you can sort of see that in this many mental status exams, it's divided into part 4. All of these are sort of being directed about sort of the thinking, memory, recall, ability to construct. All of those components are being evaluated. So let's take a look at how we do evaluate somebody. And one of the first things that we do is we assess their level of consciousness. So when you have somebody who is in full consciousness, this is a person who is alert, attentive, follows commands. Somebody who is lethargic is typically, I think of somebody who's lethargic as almost like the drunk person, who the person's drowsy, awakens, though not fully to stimulation. They can answer and follow commands, but then they fall asleep. So, you're at a party, Jimmy becomes drunk, you go over to Jimmy, come on, you gotta get up, we gotta go. Jimmy says, yeah, we gotta go, I know, and then kind of falls back to sleep. So that would be somebody who is lethargic. Somebody who's obtunded is somebody who's kind of difficult to arouse and needs constant stimulation to follow a simple command. So you might shake them. They might arouse after a lot of shaking. They might respond with a simple yes or no, very simple commands, but then they go back to sleep and then they're confused, like they don't remember anything. Somebody who is in stupor, and this is kind of an interesting one, is that somebody who is in stupor, somebody who you have to vigorously, continuously stimulate. And that stimulation is continuously and oftentimes painful. We sometimes have to do this in people who perhaps have had overdoses, might have had a stroke, a bleed, trauma. And when people are in stupor, you actually have to oftentimes use something that will cause them pain. So you might have to pinch their skin very hard. We used to actually have to push at the base of their nail to see whether or not they would become arousable. And then coma is that, you're not going to get this person, they are not arousable with any sort of painful stimulation. So going through this a little bit further as we go into cognitive functions that we assess, we did talk about their orientation. So are they alert oriented times 3? Are they lethargic? So we're going to assess that. And then some of the other things that we're going to assess is their attention. And their attention can be a variety of things. Number one, are they paying attention to what you're saying? Do they seem like they're able to answer back to you? But then you can also do what we call digit spans. Like you can say to somebody, I want you to remember these four numbers, 6216. And you ask somebody to repeat them back to you, 6216. The other thing you can do is serial sevens. And starting at 100, you can ask somebody, starting at 100, subtract 7 from that. So 100, 93, and then see how far back they can subtract 7 from 93 and further on. Now, obviously, this depends upon what somebody's background is, and if I find people having trouble with this, you could go to something simpler such as 3s. And then spelling backwards. Typically what we use is the word world, W-O-R-L-D, and ask them to spell that backwards. I personally have a difficulty in going backwards because that's my dyslexia, but that's again another attention component that we assess. Then we also will assess somebody's recent and remote memory. So a recent memory might be, what did you eat today? What time was your appointment? And maybe even recalling 3 unrelated items, such as like a lime, a boat, and a peach, and then asking them if they can repeat them back in a few minutes. Remote memory is, any sort of historical fact. Sometimes we use things like presidents or important dates in somebody's lives. And then also we will look at learning abilities. And so some things that we will do is we will ask somebody to, draw something, copy something, and that's something that we'll go ahead and assess as well. And then we can go into some higher cognitive functions, and these have to do with some things. Some of these you can actually just assess by somebody's vocabulary, and just in talking with somebody, you should be able to assess how well they are, what their thinking skills are. Their calculating ability, you can say, again, can they calculate either numbers such as the addition, subtraction, or can they multiply? What is 8 times 7? The other thing that we talk about is assessing their abstract thinking. So things that are not true black and white. And some of the big ones that we use are proverbs or similarities. And so we might say, well, tell me what the saying, a rolling stone gathers no moss mean. Or what does it mean when it says, all that glitters is not gold? Or don't count your chickens before they hatch. Or don't put all eggs in one basket. Or when the cat's away, the mice will play. Or stitch in time, so what do those mean? What do those sayings mean to somebody? Or, you can ask somebody, how does, what's similar between a mouse and a deer? Or what's different between a mouse and a deer? And see what people will say. And then also their constructional ability. So how well can they construct the pentagons? Now, I'm going to show you another movie that I want you to watch, and this is actually an interview. Again, this is from, I think, Australia. And again, it's just kind of showing you how somebody with different kind of thinking, what their thought content might actually be. So watch this and try to observe and try to make notes of what you actually see occurring, or what this patient is actually displaying. The next one is going back to the brain, and hopefully this will give you a few chuckles, but this is the brain according to Pinky. Pinky was a cartoon character from way back when. He was kind of crazy. He was like supposed to be really smart but really evil. He's like, the evil Dr. X kind of guy, the guy from Austin Powers kind of bad guy. But he was really smart, and they had a cartoon about him way back when. So he's just showing you his idea of what a brain is all about. And then finally, we're going to go back a little bit toward the cortical spinal tract again. And the reason being is that, again, I want to sort of keep in mind that, again, when signals are coming from the cortex, they are going to descend down through the spinal canal, and in the medulla, those fibers are going to cross over to the opposite side and then continue down the cortical spinal tract in the spinal cord to come out of the efferent fibers, and then go on to cause some sort of a lower motor neuron reaction. So one of the key things to keep in mind is that, we always, when we have somebody who perhaps has a stroke, and let's just sort of say that a person has a stroke up here on the left side, that will oftentimes, again, depending upon where this is, because all of this depends upon where in the brain somebody is affected. But if they have a stroke in an area that might control, let's just sort of say this finger, their stroke is going to be up in the left hemisphere, and that might actually cause some damage that's, again, not going to send those signals correctly down to the lower motor neuron that might be going down to their finger. So this finger might, actually the whole arm might be not be able to move. And you might find people who have had strokes who, what we call, have hemiparesis, meaning that they one half of their body they have weakness in. So that's the reason why you sometimes you will find that this comes into play. And then finally, I just want to end on beginning a component, what we call the upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. And the way I want you to approach this is that you have two distinct areas in your body or in your brain which have cell bodies. The first one being in the upper motor neuron, up in the brains. So you have these cell bodies which are in the cortex of the brains, and these cell bodies are what we call the upper motor neurons. These upper motor neurons are long, and they actually are one single neuron which then go down and synapse with some of the lower motor neuron. And these lower motor neuron pathways, these neurons down here are the ones that are actually going out to the periphery. So we have the upper motor neurons which synapse with the lower motor neurons, and the lower motor neurons then go on to synapse with various muscles in the body. The upper motor neurons way up here are the ones that carry information from the brain that control muscles of the body. And then the lower motor neurons carry information that's kind of passed from the upper motor neuron outward to the periphery. So what does this all mean? Okay, so what this means is that there can be instances where people might have lesions that might happen in the upper motor pathways, the lower motor pathways, anywhere in between, or all the above. And when somebody has damage to the upper motor neurons above the crossover, we again have talked about that the motor impairment is going to occur on the opposite side. Okay, so there's going to be very specific findings that you're going to find when people actually have injuries to their upper motor neuron and their lower motor neurons. So upper motor neurons, well, let me just sort of say that damage to the lower motor neurons will typically cause people to have basic paralysis, because you're going to interrupt a lot of times the reflex arcs. And in the upper motor neuron, you might find actually an opposite. So you're not going to get paralysis, but you actually get what we call spastic movements. And we're going to go through various entities in which we're going to face people who might have upper motor neuron and or lower motor neuron diseases. And depending upon where their disease process is, meaning that they might have a stroke, they might have head injury, they might have had a born with a neurological problem, they might have tertiary syphilis, they might have anemia, they might have a neuropathy, they might have Lou Gehrig's disease, they might have MS, myasthenia gravis. So all these disease processes, when they start to affect the upper and lower motor neurons, that's when they start to exhibit physical exam findings, which can be very abnormal. And so we're going to learn as time goes on, what do these really mean and what does that indicate. Not that none of us are going to become neurologists, but what do you piece together when you see somebody who might have findings on their physical exam, and what does that all mean. So again, I just want to get you a little bit introduced to this concept, and again, we're going to explore this a little bit further on as we go through the neurological exam. So I'm going to end with Pinky the brain. Yeah, Pinky's got a big brain. He's like a mean mouse, I think. And again, here's an example of the brain. So enjoy the rest of your time off, and I will see you next week. Hope the dog isn't too disturbing in the background. Don't know what his problem is. All right, take care. Bye.